parliament member under attack. Kostas Hatzidakis, a former transport minister, is charged by protesters. Some shout, "Thieves," and "Shame on you." MP was finally bundled away by his aides and taken to the hospital, where he was later released without serious injury. The attack comes as clashes break out between protesters and police in central Athens. Some 40,000 Greek workers took to the streets as part of a general strike against the government's austerity measures that have cut wages and increased taxes. The latest protest came after the government passed a bill in Parliament Tuesday cutting civil service.
Poland has rejected Moscow's report into the deadly plane crash that killed 96 people, including the country's president, last April in southwest Russia. The Prime Minister, Donald Tusk, has criticized the findings, describing them as groundless and unacceptable. Well, to discuss the investigation into the crash, we can now cross to David Kaminski-Morrow, who's an aviation journalist joining us from London. Thanks very much indeed for being with us here on RT. Now, the Polish Prime Minister, he slated the investigation, but didn't actually go into detail. Why do you think the report could be unacceptable to him?
Well, I think it's very simply a case of you're dealing with a highly political situation. This was really a perfect storm in terms of the worst possible combination of circumstances for this accident to have happened. And I think that the results of the investigation is going to be a very bitter pill for the Polish government to swallow. I think that the evidence that's come out so far in the reports that have been issued as the investigation has progressed have pointed increasingly towards catastrophic decision-making on board the aircraft, and I suspect that Prime Minister Tusk is finding that a very difficult.
Hello everyone, welcome to Global Government News. Today is Monday, December 20th, 2010, and I'm Darko. Welcome to this news bulletin. We're going to cover the war on terror, liberty, sovereignty, and some eugenics and some Big Brother news. It's going to be a two-parter. New listeners, please visit my website, www.ggnonline.com. That's ggnonline.com. You just watched that video on the Polish crash. If you're not, if you don't know anything about it, it was a pretty big plane crash. I mean, it had, I believe, the president, his wife, some cabinet ministers. It had like the head of the central bank. I mean, basically a head of their security. Basically, their whole administration for the Polish government was in that plane, and they just happened to be going to Russia, where they were going to commemorate the slaughtering of Polish officers by Russians during World War II. And so they're a little ticked, and they think that that plane went down for a reason. It was similar to a Pakistani plane that went down in the, around probably about the past 6 months, right before those floods kicked off. You know, it was due to fog, and they made some kind of weird maneuver prior to crashing, and so it had to do with air traffic control, the weather conditions, and communications between the airplane and the pilots and the air traffic control and that. So, but it says here thousands try to storm government building in Belarus. It says in the biggest challenge to authoritarian leader Alexander Lukashenko in 16 years in power, thousands of demonstrators massed outside the main government office to protest alleged vote fraud in Sunday's presidential election, but club-swinging riot police drove them off and beat many. And it says here the violent night left in doubt the next step for Belarus, which is of interest to the Kremlin because of its position as a buffer between Russia and the West. The West, for its part, has been offended by Lukashenko's harsh rule and resistance to change. The next one up says Glabo orders UN peacekeepers to leave Ivory Coast. Says the man who refuses to step down from the presidency ordered thousands of UN peacekeepers to leave Ivory Coast immediately on Saturday, calling the global body that has endorsed his political rival an agent of destabilization. And it says here, the statement read on state television came just 2 days after as many as 30 people were killed in street violence in the Ivory Coast. Earlier Saturday, masked gunmen opened fire on the UN base. No one from the UN was harmed during the attack. Next up is Pakistan's spy agency denies it exposed CIA chief. Pakistan's spy agency denies it exposed CIA station chief, warns of undermining relations. Pakistan's main spy agency denied it had unmasked the CIA's station chief in Islamabad and warned such allegations could damage its already fragile counterterrorism alliance with the United States. And it says here the CIA pulled out its top spy out of Pakistan on Thursday amid death threats after his name emerged publicly a few weeks ago from a Pakistani man threatening to sue the CIA. It says over alleged deaths of his son and brother in a 2009 U.S. missile strike. The attorney involved with the complaint said he had learned the name from the Pakistani journalist. So, and this has to do with the UAV unmanned drone attacks that take place almost on a daily basis in Pakistan and Afghanistan, where they're killing mostly children and women. And so the people are getting kind of pissed off, and they know who it's coming from. It's coming from the intelligence agencies. NATO trucks attacked in northwest Pakistan. I've covered this type story before. Basically, if you don't pay the Taliban, you're going to get attacked. But if you pay them, your convoy won't get attacked. NATO doesn't pay them. Unknown militants have attacked 2 NATO fuel supply trucks in Khyber Agency in northwest Pakistan. And the U.S. is funding the Taliban. They give the money to Pakistan. The Pakistanis, ISI government, their puppet government, basically trains and funds the Taliban. Afghanistan slams U.S. strategy review. And it says here, Afghanistan's chief presidential spokesman, Wahid Omar, has urged the U.S. to pay more attention to the country's economic woes and protect civilian lives during military operations. A few days after the U.S. unveiled its new war strategy in Afghanistan, Omar called on Washington to be duty-bound to protect Afghan civilian lives. If you go down here, it basically verifies what I just said. The increasing number of Afghan civilian deaths at the hands of the U.S.-led foreign forces has been drawing public anger in the war-ravaged country. Internal U.S. military statistics show the Western forces have failed to reduce the number of civilian fatalities caused by foreign forces in Afghanistan. So the United Nations has reported that civilian casualties rose over 30% in the first half of 2010 compared to the same period last year. Since the start of the 2001 U.S.-led invasion of Afghanistan, more than 34,000 Afghan civilians have been killed in the country as a result of the war. The U.S. currently has about 100,000 troops in Afghanistan. The total number of coalition forces in the country reaches 150,000. Israel destroys Palestinian shops, and it says here the Israeli military has demolished a series of unfinished Palestinian shops in the occupied West Bank in line with its policies to destroy Palestinian properties. Red shirts rally in the Thai capital. Thousands of Thai opposition supporters have gathered in the capital of Bangkok to mark the deadly military crackdown on anti-government protests 7 months ago. Stop protesters with water cannons. 85% of Tory voters like to see water cannons used on protesters, reveal the findings in the ComRes Sunday Mirror survey after the London tuition fees protest. And we already have these LRADs, long-range acoustical devices. They're basically sound cannons. I think many of you have seen them on YouTube or experienced them personally, unfortunately. But so the UK is also mulling banning protests altogether. That was an article that was posted recently. UK wants to basically ban all protests, and because they look bad after they drug a person who has cerebral palsy and was in a wheelchair. They grabbed him out of the wheelchair and drug him across the street. So they got a little spotlight on him, and they didn't like that. So now they just want to ban all protests. Real free. It's a real democratic place to live, just like the U.S. South Korea wraps up live fire drill. And we're going to keep moving up here. It says South Korea orders residents to take shelter in anticipation of drills. It says while the United Nations Security Council wrangled over growing tensions in the Korean peninsula, South Korea ordered thousands to find shelter in preparation for the South's planned live fire military exercises, which could take place within hours, the military announced. South Korean troops bracing for possible North Korean attack. South Korean President Lee Myung-bak gathered his national security leaders for strategic talks Tuesday as troops brace for possible North Korean retaliation a day after conducting artillery drills on the island of Northbound. And this was from December 20th. Next one up, U.S. lawmakers approved $160 billion U.S. Bill for military. Says the U.S. House of Representatives on Friday passed legislation that authorizes the Pentagon to spend nearly $160 billion on the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq this budget year without major restrictions on the conduct of operations. And so we have here the U.S. House passes $725 billion defense bill. The U.S. House of Representatives has passed a massive $725 billion defense bill, including around $160 billion in funding for the U.S.-led wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. It says the official cost of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan has now surpassed $1.1 trillion, and that's about, what, 1/20th or 1/10 of what we gave the bankers for the bailout. Some estimates say that between 40 and 50% of the U.S. federal budget goes towards military spending, which is far higher proportion than any other government in the world spends. And it says the legislation will continue to restrict the transfer of detainees from the Guantanamo Bay prison camp to the United States. Students look to 2012 after immigration bill fails. And it says here, emboldened by months of phone calls to lawmakers, hunger strikes, and sit-ins, a group of college students and graduates in Los Angeles say they plan to take their fight for immigrant rights to the states in the 2012 election after Senate Republicans blocked a key piece of legislation. So who knows, maybe Sarah Palin will help you out in 2012. And Sunday evening, surprise, Senate passes food safety legislation bill. So this bill was not wanted by the American people. So what do? In the middle of at the end of the weekend, as everyone's rushing around doing their last minute shopping and whatnot on Sunday and laying around watching football, they passed the Food Modernization Act. How do you like that? The Senate unexpectedly approved food safety legislation by a voice vote Sunday evening, rescuing a bill that floated into limbo for weeks because of a clerical error or because people just didn't want it, right? Said the Senate passed the Food Safety and Modernization Act, and it has nothing to do with food safety. It has to do with basically modernizing it, which is all about GMO and you not being able to grow your own food and putting RFID trackers in the food and all kinds of good stuff. So we're going to move on here and to the arms treaty debate, increasingly testy in the Senate. It says debate in the Senate over President Barack Obama's strategic nuclear arms treaty with Russia grew increasingly testy on Monday, but the White House expressed confidence lawmakers would approve the accord before Christmas break. In a letter to the Senate, Obama promises that New START treaty won't limit missile defense. President Obama issued a letter to the Senate on Sunday, pledging to fully develop a U.S. missile defense system in Europe as part of a final offensive to relieve concerns about nuclear arms pact with Russia as it moves towards a final vote. And talking about the U.S. and UN, the U.S.-EU plan Iran sanctions, and Iran's already had sanctions on them recently. And the government's been able to provide subsidies to make up for that, but they've just announced cuts to these subsidies. So now gas for the Iranian people have gone up 40%, along with the price of bread and that. And says here the U.S. and representatives of the European Union have agreed to impose joint sanctions against Iran in January and are considering breaking off talks with the country as patience with Tehran's nuclear activities, where then basically they want to produce nuclear power, and the outside countries say, no, you're not doing it for that, and if you are even doing it for energy, we don't care, we don't want you to have that. We could have it, but you can't have it. So it says here the CIA secretly agreed to pay $5 million to shield the architects of its waterboarding program. Please join me in part 2 of this news bulletin. This is GGN, and I am Darko. Thank you.